So I will concentrate on the relation between Confucianism and Buddhism, as Daoism has no real representatives. Daoism has, of course, a great influence also on Japanese culture, but there are no clear representatives of Daoism to defend it in Japan. Let me give you one example of the Chinese debate, a relatively early text, also 4th century, as you see from the dates of Sun Cho, who has written this text, and sanjiao. And in this text you find this interesting passage: the Duke of Zhou and Confucius are like the Buddha, and the Buddha is like the Duke of Zhou and Confucius. The term Buddha means to be awakened, and to be awakened means to get the meaning, and denotes an insight into the things. The Duke of Zhou and Confucius rescued the world in times of utmost distress. The Buddha illuminated its roots. So as the title of the work says, the unity of the three teachings, the text argues for an at least almost equal value of the teachings. Joachim Gens warns us that many texts say, oh, there is a unity, but somehow from the back door there is still a hidden superiority message included. Maybe it's also here if it speaks about the Buddha illuminating the roots, so it might be more basic in a way than Confucianism, but I'm not going to enter this debate here. But what we see, and what I think is very remarkable, is that we find here an emphasis on founders. I mean, it speaks about Confucius and about the Buddha. And he compares them. And I mean, obviously, he really wants to equate them, as you can see in the first sentence. Then he claims cognitive superiority for these founders. I mean, these founders, they had an insight into the things. And this insight, this cognitive superiority, seems to be connected somehow also to linguistic skills, because it is connected with this idea of getting the meaning of something. And I think this is very interesting. And from this insight into things comes these beings, they are compassionate beings, so they want to use this insight to rescue the world. Yeah? And this is, as this text says, similar with these two traditions, with Confucianism and Buddhism. So we'll look how this, or I'll try to show you that we find these ideas in many Japanese debates as well. And now we get to Japan, to Kūkai. And I mean, Kūkai is famous for many things, and among them his special dealing with Confucianism and Buddhism, and also including Daoism in some of his works. This has to do with his personal background. Kūkai grew up in a family who had a high standing at the court for some time, lost that, and then Kūkai was born, and he was very intelligent, he seemed to be very gifted, and so the family was hoping that he might restore his family to its former glory. And they sent him to the Daigaku, where he was accepted as a student, and so he was really educated in all this classical Confucian and Chinese texts. But he left the school before his graduation, in a way, and became a monk. And in already his early years, he wrote a text about this in a way, an apologetic text in a way, that's called The Gist of the Three Teachings, sangyō. And yeah, this is where I got the name of my presentation from, The Gist of the Two Teachings. And there he tries to, or it's a story about a young person who's confronted with all these three teachings, and it shows that the most effective one is Buddhism, to educate young and somehow nasty young persons. And I'll give you some quote from this text later. But what is also important, I think, is that Kūkai also imported, when he went to China from 804 to 806, he brought with him a text called Sanjiao Buchilun. Another version of this text was also imported by Saicho, so the founder of the Tendai school in Japan. And this is one of those sanjiao texts that was quite important at that time in China. So this shows that this topic of comparing the three teachings was not just a topic of his early years, but also in his later years, and especially in his last big work, the Juju Shinron, the treatise about the 10 stages of the mind, where he shows how you get from the base mind that is similar to a goat, like a ram-like mind, to awakening, and the steps on that way, they are identified with certain teachings. And the first teaching that leads you from the ram-like state to an ethical state of morality is Confucianism. The next step is Daoism, and then you have different Buddhist schools. And the last step is, of course, his own Shingon Buddhism. So, and this type of classification of teachings was a big topic, of course, in China, the so-called Panjiao systems, Kyohan in Japanese. And Kūkai, what's very peculiar is that he integrated Confucianism and Daoism into this Panjiao, into this Kyohan, because the most famous Panjiaos in China, they only included Buddhist schools. One exception is Zhongmi, who lived at the same time, more or less, than Kūkai. There are some speculations that they might have met in Chang'an at that time, but we have no real proof of that. But let me give you some passages from Kūkai, and I think this is a very interesting passage. This is from a work called Bunkyo Hifudon. The Bunkyo Hifudon is actually a compilation of poetological writings. He compiled a lot of texts, and he wrote very short prefaces to this. Like there are 3 prefaces in the whole work written by Kūkai, just really a few pages, but they, I think, contain some interesting things for our topic. So I'll read you the quote. When great immortals benefit all kinds of beings, they take teaching by names as their foundation. When Confucian gentlemen save all generations, then literature will be their basis. They were able to open up signs originally existing in heaven and earth, and to enact patterns spontaneously arising on tortoises and dragons. After having observed the changing of the seasons in the sun, moon, and stars, and the changes of the 9 continents, then with the orchestrated sounds of metal and jade, of pipes and reeds, they let their patterns stand out in order to nurture the common people. Elegantly and brightly, they let their segments shine in order to govern living creatures. Therefore, one is the beginning of names. Patterns are the source of teaching, and if one makes the teaching by names one's basis, literature becomes the essence of one's rules. So here, of course, he's somehow justifying literature. I mean, it's a poetological compilation, so he wants to also argue for the value of literature in this passage. But I think there are also, for our topic, for the comparison between Buddhism and Confucianism, very interesting things. At the beginning, he speaks about the great immortals and also contrasts them or compares them with the gentlemen. And gentlemen are, of course, are the Confucian rulers, actually. So here he does the same as that we found in the passage before, and both of them have have a similar situation. They look at, and this is what brings me somehow to the state of nature. It sounds like a very peculiar state they are in. They are watching at the nature. They're detecting certain patterns there, and then somehow they translate these patterns into literature. And this is what is similar between the Confucian rulers and the Buddha as well. And they have some cognitive superiority that enables them to do so. Another thing that I can't show you here in detail is that this whole passage is actually a pastiche of different quotations from the Confucian canon, the Taoist canon, and the Buddhist canon. It contains really a lot of things. I may point to the tortoises and dragons. This is, of course, it's a famous passage that somehow relates to the I Ching and to the Shu Jing, that these animals come out of rivers and they have signs on their backs. Nevertheless, I think there's already here some somehow hidden superiority of Buddhism in it when he says, if you compare the first two sentences, then you have that the great immortals, that is the Buddhas, they benefit all kinds of beings, whereas the gentlemen only save all generations. So generation seems to rely only to human beings and not to other beings then. Yeah, but we'll see more of that later. He goes on a little later in the same text, and then he gets some more to the differences between the teachings. He says that relying on patterns, one establishes names. That's what we have seen in the passage before. Reciting names, one achieves meanings. If the meaning of names is already clear, one uses it to illuminate the unawakened. At this point, the three teachings part company, but the five vehicles, that is the five vehicles of Buddhism, they follow the same track. The sutras and shastras are marvelous but difficult to enter. Taoist texts are dark but rarely in harmony. Confucian works are close at hand but full of conflict. I think that this passage contains the reason for Buddhism's superiority, but it's not really very clear to me what he has in mind. So what does the expression "at this point" really refer to? I believe that it refers to the meanings, because directly before that he speaks about if the meaning of names are clear, and these meanings seem to have something to do with reciting names, and recitation seems to connect somehow to esoteric rituals, I believe, but yeah. So this is one reason to believe that this, at this point, has to do something with the meanings that were mentioned earlier. The other teachings, they also have patterns and they have names, but they do not really teach meanings, according to Kūkai. And in other texts, Kūkai also speaks about that only the language of the Buddha is meaningful, has meaning, and that all other teachings are in a way meaningless. But this is a difficult topic and would take too long to really go into details. So what about the last sentences here? Is Kūkai criticizing, as it sounds in a way, inner contradictions of these teachings? If he says it's full of conflict or they are rarely in harmony, I don't really know very well, but my hunch would be that he thinks that at least these teachings are not really comprehensive. They don't comprehend the whole field that Buddhism would take. Buddhism is difficult, as he says at this point, but it seems to be comprehend more, whereas these teachings are only partial in a way. There are a lot of other passages that may somehow justify this interpretation. But let's go to another passage from the already mentioned Sangyō Shiki, so the gist of the three teachings. And there I think he has some clearer remarks about the differences. First of all, he's quite negative about Daoism and Confucianism in a way when he says, now it should be evident that the pity seeking for longevity, of Daoism and that dusty breeze of the secular world, Confucianism, are not worthy of comparison. But nevertheless, human duties were preached by Confucius. On learning them, one becomes a high government official. Not too bad. Lao Tzu taught the creation by yin and yang. On receiving his instructions, one can observe the world from a tower of a Taoist temple. Most significant and profound is, nevertheless, the teaching of the Mahayana. It teaches the salvation of oneself and others. It does not exclude even animals and birds. So here again we see that Buddhism is superior because it includes more beings in its salvific function. And I think what we have here quite clearly is different roles for the teachings. And this he will take up in the Juju Shinron, in this 10-stage treatise that he has written later. Confucianism teaches ethics, in a way. Daoism arouses the longing for transcending the world. You want to get on a higher tower and see down on the mundane events down there. But Buddhism finally saves them all, in a way. So what do we find here? We find the idea in Kūkai's descriptions. You have this idea of an insight into primordial patterns, something similar than the sanjiao. Here, very clearly, you have this idea of translating the patterns that were detected by these sages into texts. And then you have a comparison negatively for Confucians and for Daoists with regard to scope. Daoism and Confucianism don't save as many beings as Buddhism does. They are not as comprehensive as Buddhism is. And the roles differ, whereas Buddhism leads to final salvation in a way. The others can only get you to a higher level, to a moral level, or to a first somehow religious level that is connected in Kūkai's system with Daoism. So I will now jump to later times, to a Confucian response, and for that I have to go into the Edo period, so a lot of centuries later. First of all, I'll give you a quote by Hayashi Razan, who is, as you may know, himself a Buddhist monk, but who then, I don't know, can you say, converted to Confucianism, but he is also, in a way, trying to combine the teachings. And for example, in the following quote, he says that while Buddhism lists the 5 transgressions, Confucianism knows the 5 virtues. Not to kill means benevolence. Not to steal is rightness. Not to commit adultery is propriety. Not to lie is trustworthiness. And not to drink alcohol is, as we all know, wisdom. This same comparison, or this, how can you say, this relating the 5 virtues to the 5 transgressions can already be found in Kūkai's work, for example. But Kūkai did not invent it himself. It is already within the sanjiao debates in China, actually. But Hayashi Razan accepts this. And in a way, although Neo-Confucians are also criticizing Buddhism a lot, they are not as severe against Buddhism. In some cases, this has to do with individual personal reasons, as in the case of Hayashi Razan, who was a Buddhist himself, but also because Neo-Confucianism in general obviously adopted a lot of terms from until even quiet sitting, for example, so a practice that obviously has some Buddhist and maybe even Daoist influences. So the neoclassical Confucians, like for example Ito Jinsai, were a lot more critical towards the Buddhists. Ito Jinsai, for example, he criticizes exactly this moral deficiency of Buddhism, when he says that Confucians differ decisively from Buddhists and Daoists in emphasizing rightness. Buddhists gradually abandon rightness, considering it a minor way. They fail to understand that rightness is the great path of the world. Abandoning rightness is tantamount to leaving a good and proper road to travel among thorns and bushes. They certainly will get one nowhere. So this is a lot harsher critique of Buddhism, and it's somehow the classical critique. The classical critique is Confucians, they are the moral ones, and Buddhism, these are these somehow surprisingly egoistic people who leave their families, who just go out and just care for themselves, for their own awakening. I think more interesting is what Ogyu Sorai writes about Buddhism and how it connects to his own theory. When he writes about the sages, he has this very interesting passage, I think. The term sage refers to those who create. The ancient sons of heaven, possessing the virtues of intelligence, brilliance, perception, and wisdom, penetrated the way of heaven and earth and fathomed the natures of men and things. Fuxi Shenneng and the Yellow Emperor were all sages, yet during their time the way of correct virtue had not yet been created, rites and music not yet emerged. So, in a way, Sorai accepts the classical picture that we already found in the sanjiao and in Kūkai, that the sages, they were cognitively superior, as the Buddha was maybe. They had an insight into primordial patterns, or Sorai puts it, he speaks about natures, the natures of man and the nature of things. And they translated these patterns into texts, or here it might be maybe better to speak about institutions, about rites and music. And so here seems to be, Sorai stresses the same points about the sages that Kūkai also stressed in the preface to the Bunkyo Hifuron about the Confucian sages, about their abilities, their cognitive abilities. And here comes a passage before I come to a conclusion. Sorai's critique of Buddhism, and this critique is very much linked with his critique of Neo-Confucianism. He says Master Zhu, so Zhu Xi, the most prominent representative of Neo-Confucianism, he says about him, in explaining Gerbu, or Kakubutsu in Japanese, in terms of exhausting principle, did not fathom in particular that the expression exhausting principle was meant as praise for the sages, and for the sages only, for composing the Book of Changes. How could it be possible? How could it possibly be a task of which students are capable? The principle of all below heaven cannot be completely exhausted. Now, there are forms of enlightenment, in even, so satori, a Buddhist term, and even the minor ways and arts. Indeed, for any particular task, there is an enlightenment experience. For any single detail, there is an enlightenment experience. Enlightenment simply means that a person suddenly fathoms what they had previously not. But how can anyone have an all-encompassing enlightenment? So Sorai agrees with Kūkai that Buddhism is more comprehensive. But he criticizes exactly this comprehensiveness. He says this comprehensiveness is beyond human capacity. So we should not strive for salvation in the Buddhist sense, but we should form a society where everybody plays his part, learns his arts, because this partial enlightenment, this partial awakening is possible, but not the comprehensive one that the Buddhists talk about. And this society leads to happiness due to the institutions created by the sages who had the cognitive superiority to form institutions that lead to a harmonious society. So what are my conclusions? I think there we can find, and I hope I've convinced you that there are some interesting patterns in this Buddhist-Confucian dialogue. And what is similar to these teachings is that they have an idea of a cognitive superiority of the founders of these systems of thought, that they were, of course, compassionate, and so they try to transfer their insight to other beings, and they created institutions or texts. Later generations then, at first, only have partial knowledge of this, and then the Buddhists believe that this partial knowledge can be step by step be overcome, and can really lead, if we get deep into these texts and institutions, rituals, for example, then we can really get to this comprehensive insight that the founders already had. But as we have seen, Sorai, for example, is a lot more critical about that. So we have here what Rudolf Wagner, for example, has called canonical traditions. That is, we have the idea of a canon of texts that was produced at a certain moment in time, and that later generations, they can only somehow orient towards this canon of texts, towards this canon of, may also include institutions, rituals, music, and so forth, and they can only try to preserve that in a way. And so this might be typical for these two teachings. Then in Kūkai's case, I think what is interesting is I mean, I haven't mentioned that before, but for example, in this preface to the Bunkyo Hifuron, where he quotes all the classics, Taoist classics and Confucian classics, in a way, this is only, do you say boasting oneself? I mean, it's a proof of literacy. In a way, you have to show your audience that you know it all, that you have read your Kunze and so on. But what is very interesting, I think, is, and I haven't argued in detail for this, but I think that he takes Confucianism because he there finds a similar idea to his own Buddhist insight, that the Buddha sees the patterns of the world and translates this into a language. And so he believes that this language can directly transfer the message of the Buddha. And this is in contrast, for example, to Zen Buddhism and many other schools who would say that language is most of all a hindrance and can only be a skillful means to get to the truth. But for Kūkai, it's directly expressing the insight of the Buddha. And I think that by this way, he uses somehow Confucianism to argue against his Buddhist rivals, that what other Buddhists wouldn't do. So he's not that much arguing against Confucianism, in a way, because there was no big reason to do that. The discourse at his time, I think, was already deeply Buddhist in a way, or the Buddhist paradigm was already quite strong. So what he does is not really criticizing Confucianism, but using Confucianism to argue against other Buddhist schools. So this would be my working hypothesis in a way. And what I find interesting about Sora is that one might say that in a way Sora already has this modern critique of Buddhist cognitive ambitions. If we take it as typical for modernity, that we think, okay, this comprehensiveness, this viewpoint from nowhere is really out of reach for human beings, and this idea might be found already in Sorai. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Paulus. We still have a couple of minutes for maybe one or two questions. If you have questions or comments.
I don't know if you can answer this, but I'm just curious about during the Edo period, there were different reforms, Tenpyo reform, Keikyo reform. Part of those reforms would often be a repression of other schools, other Yomei school or other Buddhist schools in favor of Neo-Confucianism. I'm just wondering if that external political dynamics ever feeds into any kind of texts produced that Neo-Confucianism ever explicitly says we must suppress the other schools, get rid of the magnum and all that kind of stuff.
I mean, all this comes after Sorai, doesn't it? Let me think about. I mean, I know about debates then in Meiji Japan, where again the Buddhists who were then allowed to marry, and I mean they were forced to allow marriage and meat eating and so on, and that there then was a big reaction from the Buddhist side, arguing that these are actually that it must be permissible, and that it is somehow worthwhile to stick to this quite strict precepts. So this somehow gets back to the earliest apologetic texts, for example, in China, but this is not directly. It's connected to the Meiji reforms and not to the reforms in the Edo period. So. No, I don't know well about reactions directly to this.
Okay, fair enough.
One more question.
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I was wondering about sangyō. Well, two related questions. One is if there is a conclusion You said that there was a student or somebody
Yeah.
asking, and three representatives of each religion
Right.
would answer, and how ends the discussion? The student is convinced by Buddhist approach, and I am asking this because it reminds me a lot of Raimundus Lullius' dialogue among three monotheistic religions, and he finds in the names of God a common ground to understand each other, no? A sort of common language. And so I was curious because in the case of Lullius, the dialogue ends without solution. So the atheist just can figure out what he wants, but there is no any clear answer. And here we say that esoteric language could be this common ground, according to what you were saying about that language that can transform in Kūkai's understanding is directly expressing of the teachings of Buddha, and that could be the common ground in that case for every religion or teaching. What do you think about it?
Yeah, thanks a lot.
I don't want to be the bad guy, but
Okay, great. Okay. So I'll focus on the plot of the Sango Shiki. This is maybe easier to answer, and then we will see if we have time for the esoteric language as common ground. It's really, you have this bad behaving young guy, the alter ego of Kūkai, of course, who became a monk. But this guy, he didn't become a monk, but he started drinking and so on, gambling and all this women stuff and so on. And so his uncle wants to have him educated. And first he calls a Confucian teacher, and then he told him, okay, if you behave well and if you study diligently, and so then you will become a government official. And it all sounds great to him, and he's of course convinced by the Confucian. But some Daoist hermit, he was overhearing the talk, and then he came and he says, yeah, okay. I mean, if you want to become a government official, then Confucianism might be good. But if you want to live forever, if you want to fly on the clouds, and so I have another teaching that is a lot better. And then he teaches him Daoism. And then comes the monk, who was also overhearing this, and he convinces all of them, the Confucian and the Daoist and the nephew and the uncle and himself, that Buddhism is, of course, he speaks about the hells and the heavens, and they are really afraid and they can't move anymore. So he has to speak some mantras to awaken them, actually, not to awaken them, but to wake them up, first of all. And in the end, they all say, okay, we are all convinced Buddhism, this is it. So,
because of the power of language, perhaps. The power
because of the power, it's very a great stress on rhetoric, I would say. Actually, here he's the best rhetorician, in a way, but he's not really. I mean, this is, I think, one interesting aspect about Kūkai, but I mean, this esoteric language. So I'll come in a way to your second question. I mean, for Kūkai, the esoteric language, the language of the Buddha that really expresses the inside of the Buddha, it's mantras. And this means it's Sanskrit syllables that seem meaningless for us, but actually they have endless meanings, limitless meanings, and they exist primordially, like the signs on the back of the dragon and the signs on the back of the tortoise. And I think it's the privilege of Buddhists of the highest stages of awakening to see the whole meanings of these signs. So it's not really a common ground, but it's more, I mean, he would say, as they are limitless in meaning, these signs, they comprise the teachings of the Confucians and of the Daoists. And he even would say that, I mean, from the syllable A, all other syllables come out, and all the teachings, and in a way the Confucian teaching is a Buddhist teaching. Buddha somehow sent Confucius to convince certain kinds of people and brings them on the right path. But it's not that it's the common ground of all of them.
Primordial language.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting because
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
before
we have to talk about that
discussion
later.
about
Yeah,
primordial
sorry.
Thank you very much, Paulus.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, but